supposed to be flashing?
Yes.
Okay. So my main claim is generally television news broadcasting in America is always racial biased when it comes to news involving African Americans. This is because, from my first supporting claim, television news broadcasting has created a negative image of African Americans, portraying them as criminals. A study done by Sentencing Project reports that African American crime suspects were presented in a more threatening context than Caucasians. African American suspects were often left unnamed and were more likely to be shown as threatening by being shown videos or photos of them being detained, or by them being detained on the ground or wall. Some statistics to prove this is that the percentage of those accused, about 48.9% African Americans that were accused, their name was still in the photo, compared to Caucasians where it was only 65.3%. Now, for those where the accused was not named in the photo, it was 51.1% for African Americans and 34.7% for Caucasians. Because of this, African Americans are always thought of as nameless, menacing, and in the grasp of police. This then would make it seem where if a family is looking for a home and they see that the whole neighborhood is filled with African Americans, they would feel unsafe even though they're not familiar with them or they haven't met them personally. When the public constantly sees or hears repeatedly that African American males or females are involved in crime-related news stories, it strengthens their cognitive association between blacks and criminality in the mind. Thus, becomes chronically accessible for the use of in race-related evaluations. Also, as the research on media priming illustrates, even a single exposure to these unfavorable characterizations can produce stereotype-based responses. Another study done by The Color of Change depicts how the percentage of African American suspects in TV crime reports in New York were higher than the percentage of the average New York Police Department arrest rates within the years of 2010 and 2015. For murder within New York, it was 54% of the suspects who were arrested were African Americans, which is the average, but on a TV news, 74% of the crime reports were African American suspects. From this information and statistics, we see how television news broadcasting in the U.S. mostly show African Americans in a negative way, which leads to Americans having this idea that they are all criminals, basically categorizing them as one. Thus, this supports my main claim that television news broadcasting in America is always racial biased when it comes to criminal news involving African Americans. For my second supporting claim, it's because journalists gravitate towards criminal cases where the assailant was African American. Studies drawn by the Sentencing Project have shown that newsworthiness is not a product of how representative or novel a crime is, but rather how well it can be scripted using stereotypes grounded in racism. Robert Edmond, who is a professor of media and public affairs and a professor of international affairs at George Washington University, says it is crucial to understand that journalists sometimes may not support racism. Instead, it is because the news personnel shape reports in accordance with professional norms and conventions rather than their own perspective. In a table done by Robert Edmond in his article Blacks in the News, shows that 11% of the news stories about African Americans compared with 29% of those stories about African Americans accused of crimes were less likely to allow them or their defenders to present information in their own voices. Now, whenever it was an African American police official speaking of a case, they were mostly speaking for 32.3% were African Americans, whereas it would only be 4% if they were speaking for Caucasians. Now, if it was a Caucasian police official speaking on behalf of a case, most 48.4% of those cases would be African American, whereas it would be 94.7% if it was Caucasian. This suggests that African Americans are treated less humanely and less individualistically due to the fact that journalistic practices nowadays lead to journalists looking for criminal cases where the assailant is African American. This also supports my main claim that television news broadcasting in America is always racially biased when it comes to news involving African Americans. In conclusion, if we ever wish to end this racial bias in television news broadcasting, journalists must then not always be so drawn to portray African Americans in a negative way. Instead of trying to appeal to audiences' stereotypes and professional norms that have been established over the years, we must show the news for what it really is, not for what will increase their ratings. Thank you. Do I leave it on?
Leave it on, yeah, you don't, I'll turn it off.
Okay.
But don't stand there, because that makes you a target. All right, well, the propositions identified, it's a little convoluted, it probably needs to be simplified a bit, but I think ultimately we get the point that you're talking about. There's no preview of what the supporting structure is going to be. You dive right into your first supporting argument. That supporting argument is phrased, again, it's relatively clear, although I do think you could simplify it for the purpose of a oral presentation. It probably works better as an essay, the way you've got it written, than it does as a speech. And I think that's one of the problems that I run into in a lot of what you've got in your presentation, is that there's so much data that's presented statistically that we don't really get a chance to understand what the inferences are and what that data really means, because there's another piece of data coming along almost instantaneously. In the body of the speech, you signposted the two supporting points. The assumptions on each point are somewhat explained, although, like I said, you have a tendency to try and let the statistics make the argument for you instead of making the argument and then showing how the statistics support those points of view. This is going to be a problem that we run into frequently when we get to the debates, and it's not you. I'm just talking about people do this on a regular basis. They often just present the evidence, but don't tell me what inference we're supposed to draw from the evidence or why the evidence leads to a particular conclusion. And that's one of the things that I think happens a little bit. You've got a lot of sources that you cite, which is fine, and you've got there's a lot of statistical information in the research that you're presenting, but it often piles up before we get a chance to figure out exactly what it's saying. There were a couple of sections where it sounded like you were going with the absolute contradictory conclusion on a couple of points, and I'm going, wait, what is that? And it was not clear because you're reading some more information and some more numbers instead of telling us, here's what this ends up meaning. This means that when a crime is occurring and it's covered by the news media and the accused is white, typically here's what happens. And the statistics show that this happens. So there's clearly some kind of bias here. They're looking for sensationalism, and they see blacks as being, or African Americans as being, the group that's going to get them the most attention. Something like that. Or, for example, the criteria are whatever cover the most sensationalist crimes, and those just happen to be the ones that are committed by African Americans, and so we get a false image of what the crime rate is like. I mean, there are a couple of things. I think, if you sat down and processed your argument over the next hour, we'd figure out mostly what you're saying. But we shouldn't have to be working that hard. You're the one who's supposed to be doing all the work. You're supposed to be helping us understand, not forcing us to interpret what's going on. And that just is a consistent problem. Like I said, lots of statistics. I thought you had a good variety of sources. You cited them very regularly. The presentation also doesn't help. You have a tendency to just read you don't really look at people and engage us during the presentation, and that's something that I think would help your credibility as well. All right, thank you.